Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to address you during the Great Smart Development and Vision 2021 digital conference and to talk to you about the great green growth transformation that we all require. I will first talk to you a little bit about the deep sustainability crisis that we are living through and whether the recovery from the COVID pandemic can be green. Particularly to discuss a bit the role of green science and technology to enable such a green recovery and who will pay for it, how we can finance the great green growth transformation. I'll end with some recommendations for green new deals in emerging and developing economies that GGGI has come up with. First, I believe that by now it needs no further discussion that we are already living through a time where we see climate change impacts, increased heat waves, forest fires, droughts and floods have convinced most everybody that climate change is real, that it's serious and indeed the most important crisis of our time. But it's not the only environmental sustainability crisis. At the same time, we are faced with the air pollution crisis that kills as many as 7 million people a year, the majority of which in Asia, certainly including here in Seoul, in Korea, where we live and struggle with air pollution on a regular basis. But also things that are much less easy to see, the plastic that we all use and it ends up in the oceans and causes a plastic crisis there. Altogether, I could go on and on, but we are living through a deep sustainability crisis, and then COVID struck. Last year in 2020, the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis that it caused provided an enormous shock for human development. Even during the financial crisis, as you can see in this slide, which plots the change in human development as recorded by the UNDP, even during the global financial crisis in 2008-2009, there was a small blip in human development improvement, but the trend was still positive. Compare that to the deep negative change that we saw last year. Fortunately, if I can say, the silver lining is that many people through the COVID pandemic have come to realize that our old lifestyle is indeed not sustainable. And the number of recommendations that the COVID recovery should be green and should not only help us recover from the COVID-induced economic crisis, but at the same time help to address the climate crisis and the many other sustainability crises that I just referred to. That, I think, has been said many times, but unfortunately, even though very vast sums of money have been mobilized, particularly by the G20 economies, some $16 trillion to date, only a small share of that can be truly counted as green. As GGGI, we have argued from July last year that there are real opportunities to achieve green growth and climate action by building back better. Probably the most important argument is that green investments in renewable energy, but also in energy efficiency, in green buildings, do provide more jobs, more green jobs, than the similar investments in brown fossil fuel projects, often by a factor of 2 to 5. That, to us, is the heart of the argument of why the recovery, the stimulus to fund the recovery, should be green. Some countries, particularly the European Union and Korea, have, of course, announced a Green New Deal, or in Korea's case, a Green and Digital New Deal in July last year. At the time that New Deal was announced, there was no clear target attached to it, but potentially the most important positive thing that we've seen during 2020 is that many countries pledged to go carbon neutral by 2050, that they have made net zero 2050 pledges, and including Korea in October last year. Earlier this year, in April, in the Climate Leaders Summit hosted by President Biden, President Moon also committed to end finance for international coal projects, where Korea to date has been one of the key financiers. And in May, at the P4G summit, the President announced that Korea's green share of its official development assistance will be increased significantly. Still to come, as promised by the President, before COP26 in November of this year, Korea will announce an increased commitment for greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. In our view, that should be an increased ambition in line with the ambition of the European Union, the US, Canada, and Japan, and that means 45 to 50% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030. That is indeed a very big challenge. Can society reduce emissions that rapidly? Well, first, do we have the technology? Do we have the knowledge, the science to do so? And I think by now, most people, most governments, most investors have become convinced that investing in renewable energy is not only the right thing to do, it's also the commercially attractive thing to do, it's the economically wise thing to do. 2020 was the year in which a record amount of solar and wind energy was added to the world's energy generating capacity. But according to the International Energy Agency, to go to net zero by 2050, the speed at which renewable energy gets added to the grid would have to be increased by a factor of 4. So yes, this is a critical part of the overall transition. It has to be accelerated. At the same time, the cost of batteries has fallen enormously, and that means that there is an enormous opportunity to change our transportation, which also has a big impact on the air quality in cities. We already see some electric vehicles on the streets, and in Korea some hydrogen vehicles, but to achieve net zero by 2050, we'll need to see an adoption rate of those e-vehicles increase 18-fold. Not as readily available are electric buses, although we do expect to see more and more of those on the streets here in Seoul and in many other countries as well. And finally, we'll need to have some solution for hard to abate industrial sectors, hard to decarbonize, and it looks like green hydrogen, hydrogen produced with renewable energy or through run-of-river hydropower, is a key solution that is not quite yet ready to come to market, but will be very soon. And then there are solutions that are not requiring new technology, that in fact require just a much more widespread implementation, and that also do deliver a large number of green jobs, particularly related to energy efficiency in green buildings and in industry as well, particularly related to heating and cooling. Finally, more attention should be given to nature-based solutions. That is a high priority of the COP26 chair, the United Kingdom this year. More focus on reforestation, on rehabilitating degraded ecosystems, and on climate-smart agriculture. In short, the conclusion is we do have solutions. It is possible to reach net zero carbon neutrality by 2050. But the key question then is, who will pay for that? How can we finance the green transformation? I can see through many discussions, many panel discussions, many conferences that I've participated in, that the trends in green finance are very rapid. In the private sector, we see a very rapid increase in ESG, environment, social, and governance issues reaching the boardrooms. We see that financial disclosure of climate risks, probably following the so-called TCFD, the Task Force on Disclosure of Financial Risks guidelines, will probably become mandatory quite soon. and we see there is a rapid increase in green bonds and more countries issuing such green bonds. We also see a lot of opportunity for more blended projects, blended public and private finance. That is government finance or climate finance or development assistance, bringing in a larger volume of private finance. That is indeed an example of leveraging climate finance, where the Green Climate Fund, also in Korea, is one of the key players. Minister Han of the Environment at the P4G meeting recently said that Korea will introduce a green taxonomy in 2021, which will clearly show what projects, what private sector activities are green, can be counted as sustainable, will help against greenwashing, but also will be a big boost for the green finance market. So in our view, in fact, there is enough money generally available to finance a green transition. Probably what is lacking are projects, bankable projects that green finance can flow through. Particularly in developing countries, GGGI notes that there is a lack of such bankable projects, and we help develop those. That is, develop projects that are in between those public sector projects that do not provide return on capital, and in between the obviously commercial projects where the private sector will take care of itself without assistance, in that gray zone in between, where maybe projects need to be de-risked or where some public finance need to be used to attract private sector finance. Let me give you some examples. So GGI prepares projects in a systematic manner to prepare projects, and in the last 5 years we've demonstrated that it is possible to find funding for such projects if they are well prepared. We've mobilized about $2 billion of green and climate finance in a number of different sectors. I give you an overview here. That money comes both from the public sector, that means from governments and from development assistance and climate finance, and from the private sector. And you see that for sustainable landscapes, for reforestation, most of the funding comes from the public sector, while for renewable energy, for solar renewable energy, most of the funding comes from the private sector, because those activities are already commercially attractive. In e-mobility, for instance, for the moment, most of the funding comes from the public sector, but that we see change quite rapidly in the next few years. What kind of projects are we discussing? For example, in 2020, GGI helped develop India's first highway solar project, 250 megawatt of solar PV to be installed along the highway interchanges of the new Mumbai-Nagpur highway, major highway. And this year we're following that up by making that highway ready for e-mobility. Very different project, more complicated, is setting up a green bank, Mongolian Green Finance Corporation, working together with Mongolian banks, working together with the government, and in the end finding the Green Climate Fund ready to provide a significant amount of equity capital for such a green bank. Very different again, working on using food and organic waste in India to create Bio-CNG to replace fossil fuel compressed gas in the transport sector. Another project we're working on, a project on retrofitting, energy efficiency increase in residences in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, projects to bring electric buses to Nepal, and projects to bring better management to peatlands in Kalimantan by, in a way, providing carbon credits to government to support those actions. Just some examples of green projects for which we can find financing that can support the great green growth transformation. In the end, we therefore believe that a Green New Deal is not just for the EU and Korea, but it's also important for emerging and developing economies. We've come out last year with our recommended Green Deal, which was similar to the Green New Deal for Korea, except that it had a much larger focus on natural capital investment, on nature-based solutions, on restoration of forest, peatlands and mangroves, and on climate-smart agriculture. In short, we believe that a green recovery is critical, and the key argument for that is that green investments can generate 2 to 5 times more jobs than fossil fuel alternatives, and that the good news is that many green investment projects are commercially attractive, which means that the private sector can finance them, sometimes with support from public or climate finance. Therefore, while carbon neutrality or net zero 2050 is a major challenge requiring massive finance flows, it is possible. The private sector is ramping up quickly. Their ESG interest is impressive to see, and it will also become mandatory to disclose green activities and climate risks. In short, we see many opportunities for Green New Deals in developing and emerging economies, but they deserve an increasing share of ODA, as President Moon has committed, and we are very pleased that GGGI expects to launch a Korean-funded Green New Deal Trust Fund to be launched in 2021. With that, I come to the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.